what this is going to feel a little bit like, I don't know if you remember, some of you are probably too young, but remember when you watched the first Lord of the Rings movie? Remember that? And you watch for like 3 hours, and then Frodo says, and now we're going to take this ring up the mountain, and the credits roll. You're like, what the heck? We watched this whole 3 hours just to start the movie? That's how this first 40 minutes is going to feel. I'm going to kind of stop us right in the middle of this conversation. So can't promise any cliffhanger or anything like that, but it is going to feel like we're just going to drop the curtain on this first one, and then we'll have more time in the afternoon. But hopefully between what we did this morning and then these 40 minutes, there'll be plenty of fodder for conversation. So again, I want to remind us of our big question, which is, why is faith formation so difficult? And now I want to, with this idea of identity in mind, I want to take another step up and look at what it actually means to be living in a secular age. What does that mean for us? And I think it's different across the Western world, but I think there's some things that we share. So as I tell you this story, I do want to be wary, and I don't want you to become like this dog in this, my favorite thing the internet has given us. So don't become like this dog as we have this conversation. I love that so much. It's just, I could watch this for hours. But so much of getting into philosophical, theological conversations feels like that. Like you see the ball and then it disappears. What's happened? So that could happen here. Just stay with me, and this will land this plane in some way. So I want to start with two stories that frame this kind of thought for me of what it means to actually live in a secular age, and particularly in my country, all these discussions about faith formation and the need to really push into thinking about faith formation. About 6 months ago or so, I was at a church in Jacksonville, and one of the vocational hazards of talking a lot about youth ministry and young people is after presentations, people like to come up and tell you about their own children, which is great. It is beautiful. So I was at this presentation, and this woman in probably her late 50s came up. Her name was Elaine, and Elaine wanted to tell me about her kids. And she first said, I have an older son. He's in his late 20s now. And she said, this boy was a challenge from us from the beginning. And she said, I knew at 7 years old that church was not for him. And she said every week from basically 7 years old on was just fighting him to go to church. And she said finally by the time he was in grade 7, we gave up. She said, I knew it was a problem when at about 8 or 9 I was praying for him, and he stopped me in the middle of it and said, Mommy, don't pray for me. I really don't know what the difference between you praying to God and praying to a magical yellow bunny, what the difference is, so just don't do it. She said, I felt terrible. I felt like, how can I be a good mom? How can I be a particularly good Christian mom when I have a young child who feels this way? And then she said, I would have felt worse if it wasn't for my younger daughter, Marissa. And then she told me about Marissa. She said Marissa was exactly the opposite of her brother. She loved going to church. When she was little, she would literally jump up and down to go to church. She got involved in the youth ministry, and she was just kind of a classic youth group, youth ministry kid, went to the Bible study. They had a youth worker at the church, spent time with the youth worker, went on their mission trips. She was just a kind of classic church kid. And Elaine said, that felt much better, because that's how my husband and I were invested in the church, and we felt like at least 1 out of 2 isn't bad. We felt pretty good about this. Said, well, Marissa went to university, and she came home. It was after her second year of university. She said she had just finished a semester abroad studying economic structures in a globalized world or something. And she said, I just said to her matter-of-factly as she was home, I said, church is tomorrow. Are you going to go to church with me? And Marissa said matter-of-factly back, it's not for me anymore. And Elaine said, I should have responded better, but I was just taken aback, and all I could say was, why? Shocked. And then Marissa, again, just kind of matter-of-factly said, I just don't think you need that. I mean, it was good for me when I was younger, but, I'm not sure you need to go to church to be a good person, and I'm not sure you even need to believe in God. And she said, I'm not saying I'm an atheist, but I might be. She says, look at my roommates. Some of my roommates have never been to church a day in their lives, and they're really good people. They fight for ecological justice. They're out on the front lines doing all sorts of stuff. And Elaine said to me, I know her roommates. They are incredibly engaged. So Marissa said, I'm done. I'm finished. And so she looked at me and she said, I guess both of my kids are nuns, which is this sociological category of kind of when you are on variables in a study saying that your religious affiliation is none, N-O-N-E. She said, I guess both of my kids are nuns. She said, if both of my kids are nuns, then I'm a done. Because she said that the moment Marissa said, I'm unhappy, she said, I realized that I was too. She said that I didn't want to go to church, that I'm sick of struggling to get this church to wake up. And then she said, then she whispered to me and said, I haven't been back to church 6 months. This is the first thing I've been to. So she was in my mind. Second story was that I had a phone conversation with a group of denominational religious professionals. Now, this is not a picture of denominational professionals. This is a Google Images picture of a business group that wants to sell you car insurance. So you can find these people if you want to, but we'll allow them to stand for, symbolically, a church of denominational religious officials who wanted to set up a phone call because they were having an event. They wanted me to be the speaker at it, and they wanted to make sure I didn't blow it, that the themes of the things I wanted to talk about would fit with them. Totally understood. And as I was talking to them, all the kind of buzzwords started right away. So listen, the reason we want you to come is because we're dealing with all sorts of things like moral therapeutic deism, which is a whole conversation we've had in youth ministry. We're dealing with the rise of the nuns. We're losing our young people. We need to think about faith formation. One of them even said, listen, the church has no future unless we can get young people engaged. And then what started happening was all sorts of adjectives were started to be thrown in front of faith. Like what we need is we need our ministers, our youth workers to be inspired to be able to create consequential faith or vibrant faith or super meaningful faith. All sorts of adjectives got thrown in front of it. And I started to get skeptical. I didn't say this on the phone, but I started to wonder why the need to throw adjectives in front of faith. Like what do we mean when we do that? Now, truth of the matter is I was being a little bit haunted by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I've been haunted by Bonhoeffer for about 25 years. And Bonhoeffer has these hidden but now discovered 8 theses on youth work. And I just want to share the first one with you. And in many ways, we could just talk about this the whole time. But this is what Bonhoeffer says. This is going to be hard to see, I think, but I'll read it to you. He says, since the days of the youth movement, and of course he's talking about the German youth movement in the 1880s up until really the beginning of World War II. Since the days of the youth movement, church youth work has often lacked an element of Christian sobriety that alone might enable it to recognize that the spirit of youth is not the Holy Spirit, and that the future of church is not youth itself, but rather the Lord Jesus Christ alone. It is a task of the youth not to reshape the church, but rather to listen to the Word of God. It is a task of the church not to capture the youth, but to preach, to teach and proclaim the Word of God. That's a profound statement. Now you have to recognize that Bonhoeffer is saying this, and I've written a whole book on this, as a youth worker. Bonhoeffer spent almost all of his ministry career working with children and with youth. But he's giving us a warning here that I think is quite prophetic, at least in my country, that capturing the youth seems to be the way to keep our institutionals vital or important. And he's trying to remind us that the church has no future. Of course we think this church has no future if we don't have younger generations of people, sure. But the church actually has no future if we lose the proclamation, the obedience to Jesus Christ. And so part of what youth ministry has to be is something more than just capturing young people. So as I was talking to these folks, I started to wonder, do we throw adjectives in front of faith because our objective is really to capture young people? Now, as I thought about this, I wondered if the way Marissa and her mom were thinking about faith and the way these religious professionals were thinking about faith was really in 2 very different ways. So at the risk of being a little bit obscure, I want us to think about this as kind of a triangle. In that, obviously, faith has something to do with belief, but I want it to be more than just kind of this thought of rational belief or consent to propositions, but to think about it as an encounter and participation with the divine being. But there's always ways that we express that faith, practices we do, ways we understand ourselves. And that always happens in some kind of conditions, some kind of context, some kind of circumstances. Now, I think what's happened across our Western world is that these expressions and these conditions have really what modernity does is start pulling these things apart further and further, that they're no longer really close together, that they get pulled apart. David Brooks, the American political thinker, has this line where he says, you are in a very different cultural context, that if you're in a cafe, when you're in a cafe, people will be much more upset by seeing a pregnant woman smoking than someone saying, "God damn it." Almost no one cares if you hear someone say, "God damn it," but people will be morally outraged seeing a pregnant woman smoke. His point isn't what one's right or wrong. It's just that this is a very different cultural context. Elizabeth Johnson, the Catholic theologian, is quoting Ronner, and she has this quote where she says, you're in a very different cultural context, that if in the newspaper tomorrow on the front page they said that there were a group of theologians that gathered at the Vatican or maybe in Berlin or somewhere, they gathered and they discovered from looking at ancient texts that there's actually not 3 persons in the Trinity, but there's 4. She said you're in a very different context if that showed up in the newspaper and realizing that the society probably wouldn't care at all. I don't know what they think. Where if you rewind 1,000 years, 2,000, that would freak everyone out. That would change the way people think. The expressions of how we live our lives and so the conditions start to get pulled apart. So I want us to think about this. Now, I think that's what modernity does, is it pulls these things apart. I had a conversation with a pastor a few months ago, and he came up to me after a presentation, and he said to me, I have no idea what I'm doing. It was this very beautiful moment of a confession. He says, listen, I have no idea what I'm doing. He said, I've been at this for 12 years. I've been the pastor of this church. But honestly, I have no clue what I'm doing. But as he said that, then the confidence came back. He said, I actually have a really good idea what I'm doing. Like, I'm good at it. I'm a good pastor. I preach a good text. I go to workingpreacher.com. I use this stuff. He says, I run a good meeting. I know what I'm doing. And then the kind of question came back, but he says, honestly, I have no idea what I'm doing. In other words, he can do the expressions of being a pastor, but he's not sure they make any real impact in the conditions that people live in every day. So again, I want us to see how these things start to kind of pull apart. Feels a little obscure, but hold on there with me. And I think when it came to Marissa and her mom, that they were really asking the questions of how do I have faith inside these conditions, inside this context. Where the religious professionals were often asking the question, thought about faith, is how do we get people to express this? How do we get people to come? In my country, how do we get people to give? How do we get them to do these things? And yet that's not really the question Elaine and her mom, Elaine and her daughter were asking. So these things can be pulled so far apart. Now, I think as we push this and as we think about this, I want to tell you the story of how these things kind of get pulled apart and what that means for us as we think about faith formation. So I do want us to look at the fact that there was a time where these things were really close together, these expressions and these conditions. And my real big point here is that when they're close together, faith formation is quite easy, or it's almost innate when the expressions and conditions are really close together. As they get pulled apart, it gets more difficult. And I want to tell us the story of what that means and what we do about that. But to tell you that story, we actually have to do some genealogy work. And genealogy, at least in my country, is all the rage. There's actually a website called Ancestry.com because no American knows where they come from because Americans don't think there's any history past 1970 or something. So you can pay a bunch of money to figure out where you come from. But of course the idea of this is you're part of who you are today because of what has happened in the past. So I want us to do some genealogy work. And we actually have had in the last few years, I think one of the most important living philosophers has given us this incredible genealogy. His name's Charles Taylor, and he's a McGill, Montreal Canadian philosopher, still living, he's almost 90 now. But in 2007, he wrote a brick of a book that is a beautiful, important book, not an easy book, important book, but it's like 800 pages. So it's great to keep your door open on a very windy day. It will do that. But it's also a really important book, and what's fascinating about it is he really only has one question. It takes him 800 pages to answer one question. And his one question is an incredibly relevant one for us. And his question is, why in 1500? If we were just to rewind, and he's thinking just about the Western world. He's talking about those who are the leftovers of Latin Christendom. So those of us in Western Europe and in North America. If you were to rewind 500 years in Europe, why was it nearly impossible to find someone who didn't believe in God? It was really hard. In a short 500 years in the West, things have almost completely flipped, where it's much more difficult to believe in God than to not. What's happened in these 500 years? And it's a fascinating argument. And I want to lay that against thinking about what it means in the context of ministry for us. So we'll do this genealogy work, but to do genealogy work means we're going to do some time traveling. And the only way to time travel is to get in your DeLorean and get your flux capacitor going. You remember people have seen Back to the Future? And this is a classic thing that America has given the world, is Michael J. Fox and Back to the Future. So we're going to put both Marissa and then our religious professionals in this DeLorean and look at what's changed that's made faith formation so difficult. My hope is that you see some of these changes and it starts to ignite some of our imagination of how we can respond to this. So you ready? Are we willing to get into our DeLorean and go? Let's start by putting Marissa and her mom. You can see where my actual computer skills broke down. This is the best I could do, so, sorry. So we're going to put them in our DeLorean, and we're going to go through Taylor. Taylor has these kind of triads that he moves through, and the first one is what I call the ages, and I think it gives us a helpful sense of what's changed here. And Taylor says that the first of these ages is what he calls the ancient regime. And for me, as an American at least, you just think of kind of the world of kings and queens, and where this was ordered around kind of royal rule in this sense. But if we think of identity at this time, that one's identity, it was really hard to imagine yourself outside of your religious identity, or one's regular identity and their religious identity were the same. I just spent about 6 weeks in France and kind of reading a lot of French history and things like that. If we go back to kind of the French context around 1500, there was no way to imagine yourself as French without going to Mass. There's no way to imagine yourself without being within these deep kind of practices of religious life, that they were really one and the same. Your identity really was your religious identity. You wouldn't even think about it like that. They were all really supported in one to another. It would be really even hard to talk about faith formation here. The whole society formed faith. Now, there are a number of things that supported this and allowed this to exist that just aren't there for us anymore. And the first of these, of course, is that there was a sense during this time that the world was a deeply enchanted place, and that people were quite vulnerable, that there were demons and devils everywhere, and that you needed the church in some way to protect you from this. So I had an experience in my Presbyterian church a few years ago where I taught confirmation. And we're a small little Presbyterian church, and so we go through kind of ebbs and flows of having young people who then graduate and go off to college. And so I was the worst youth worker ever because I had 3 young people, and I took our youth group down to 0 because they all graduated. But I took them all through confirmation, and in our church, on Confirmation Sunday, when it's your turn to be confirmed, you get to stand up in front of the congregation and tell the congregation what this experience has been like for you. So this young, great kid named Ben gets up. He's the last kid to get confirmed, and he takes about 8 minutes to just kind of share his faith story, what this has meant for him. Beautiful kid. But his talk just fit completely kind of the ethos we live in. He got up and he said, hey, yeah, this has been a really great experience for me. But, what I realized through it all is whatever works for you is cool. And, Jesus is good, but, if that doesn't work for you, that's fine. And, just whatever makes you feel good is really what God wants and things like that. And I'm sitting in the back pew and slowly just going down, trying to hide under the pew. And then I'm in another existential crisis, and I'm thinking to myself, I travel around the world and tell people how to do this, and this is what's happened here? And so then I started playing this game with myself. There's this American comedian who plays this, he does this bit where he says he plays this game with himself when he's bored, called Of Course Not, But Maybe. He says it goes like this. He says, it's an inappropriate game, but I can't help myself. He says, I think of it like this, like peanut allergies. I think to myself, of course. Of course, if anyone has a peanut allergy, every precaution should be taken to make sure that person is safe. Of course, the way we deal with food, of course, there should never be peanuts on airplanes, of course. He says, but I'm ashamed of this, but then I think to myself, but maybe if we did this for like 2 weeks, we'd be done with the problem. No, of course not. So, but then I think, well, of course not. My nephew has this. Every precaution should be taken. But then I think, maybe if a peanut's going to kill you, you're supposed to die. No. So I'm sliding back in my pew, and I start to play with myself, of course not, but maybe. I think, of course. Of course we should have the kind of theology where God is completely merciful, where God upholds us and takes us in, where God just gives a grace after grace. But maybe if you don't tell 15-year-old boys they're going to burn in hell forever, they never listen to a word you say. Of course not, but maybe. we go back to the ancient regime, living in an enchanted world, was this kind of deep sense of vulnerability. Keith Thomas, a church historian, tells the story about one of the biggest issues that was happening in medieval Europe was the issue around taking the Eucharist. And if you've watched a mobster movie, you see those moments where they take the host and then you have to stick your tongue out and show it. The issue that came about, the practice came about because they discovered that a bunch of people here in medieval Europe were taking the host and not swallowing it. And then they were leaving church with it in their mouth, taking it out, crumbling it up, and putting it in their crops, feeding it to their sick pig. And so when clergy gathered in the Middle Ages, one of the big hot issues that would lead you to come to an event like this was figuring out what to do with people sneaking the host out of church. I have never met any pastor who has said their biggest temptation is taking the host after communion and putting it on their computer to make sure the operating system reboots. Like, we just don't tend to think about that. But that was a huge issue there. And so that's why you had to stick out your tongue to prove that you had actually swallowed the host, this deep sense of enchantment. At our little church, we give communion. We're in a circle, and we pass the communion to each other and say the person's name and say, the body of Christ broken for you. And so my wife is leading it, and so I have my kids with me, and this is the 14-year-old now, not cute 7-year-old. My 14-year-old is sitting next to me, and the bread comes. This is the host. This is communion. And it comes, and he turns to me, and he whispers, and he says, "Is that gluten-free bread?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm out. I'm not going to take it." And it took everything in me not to strangle the boy in front of church. But think of that incredible imaginative change of thinking about himself. That not standing in front of the host in awe and fear of what it could do to you. But the sense of, well, I mean, I don't like gluten-free. My mom is gluten-free, and I'm 14, and I hate everything my mom does, so I'm out. Completely different kind of transition in the way we think about this. That we live in this very kind of disenchanted kind of realm. Second point that kind of supported this is that time was different. The way we thought about time was in a completely different framework. It's even hard for us to imagine what this was like. But we tend to think about time in this very linear way. So we would plan kind of the crucifixion happening around 33 AD or something at some point, and then you move and you could get to July 2015, and then you could get to Good Friday 2018. And of course, July 15th comes before this. That's how we tend to think. But part of Taylor's point is that's not how people in the ancient regime would think. In an enchanted world, time was different. And we still have some resonance to this. There are moments we have where we're with family, or moments at a concert or something where we feel like time is not as linear as we think it is. But we tend to live with this kind of linear imagination. It's hard for us to even draw it in a different way. But for people living in the ancient regime, Good Friday 2018 would actually be closer to the day of the crucifixion than just some ordinary day on July 2015. That day, that holy day, would be closer to this. There was a big faith formation program in the United States that was talking about kind of passing on faith to young people. And one of the suggestions was, one of the expressions that could help faith move forward was when your son or daughter turned 15, to have a kind of ceremony or ritual where you give them a watch. And you give your child a watch and you pray over them and say that God is watching you, which seems a little creepy, that God is watching you, but that your time matters to God. Beautiful. But on another level, to try to do that goes against our whole larger cultural conceptions. And to have that practice, that expression, really make any sense, you have to live outside a kind of linear unfolding of time itself. So this becomes a big challenge. To even take on distinct rituals inside of a family are always coming up against the larger cultural expressions. And we tend to default into thinking time as this kind of linear thing. So time was quite different. And then speeds. We don't have to talk much about speeds, but this deep sense of hierarchy. But the big point here is how things themselves were charged with holy significance. So there's all sorts of stories that if you could get yourself church keys back then, they would hold power. Or the priest's robe. I mean, all of these things were important. If you could get even coins that had been put in the offertory, those held significance. I've been amazed these last few months as I've been around Europe about how all these beautiful cathedrals we still have were really reliquaries. So you go to Saint-Chapelle in Paris, this incredible stained glass. It was built because they thought they had the thorns. They thought they had Jesus' thorns, so that was built. You go to Chartres, and they think that they have Mary's cloak, and that's why you build this incredible cathedral. Or you go to Venice, and you go to St. Mark's Basilica, and that's built because they think they have St. Mark's bones. So the things themselves lead people to create incredibly beautiful structures to house the thing. For our modern mind, that seems stupid and a waste of resources. And the reason to build a beautiful building would be to attract people. But for them, you build this beautiful building because the power of this thing itself. And we tend not to live with that kind of imagination, that things themselves could be charged with significance in meaning. Now, we still have that in some ways. Like, for instance, there's a big story 2 Super Bowls ago, American football, about Tom Brady. You know who Tom Brady is? That Tom Brady's football jersey got stolen, and this happened in Texas, and they got the Texas Marshals, like their highest police force, to find this jersey again. So we think we've outgrown this, but we still tend to think things celebrities touch and things like that hold some kind of significance. So we're always haunted by these realities. But the way that speeds changes is, the way speeds and things becomes quite significant. The fourth point here that I think maybe is even most relevant for us is that there's this deep sense of the self being porous. That for people in the ancient regime, there was a big idea that stuff could get inside of you, that you could be overtaken by something. If you go back to the 4th century, there's a great story about Augustine, where when Augustine got sick, he had the flu or a cold or something, his beloved mother Monica took him, stripped him naked, got him wet, and rolled him in salt. The idea being he's sick, he's vulnerable to evil forces getting inside him, but demons don't like salt. So if you wrap him, you protect him. So my very bad, corny joke is it's clear that demons like the sweet more than the savory. And you all roll your eyes. But what's interesting is you roll your eyes at the terrible joke, but if we were to go back 500 years, a few of you, I doubt, you can tell me at lunch if any of you felt this way, but probably none of you got nervous and thought, oh my gosh, this guy's standing up in front of us in this church, and he just insulted demons. None of you stood up and said, excuse me, sir, you've made us all vulnerable now. We all are incredibly vulnerable. It's very hard for me to imagine that there could be demons somewhere putting a vendetta on my head for a bad joke. But it would not be that unusual for our ancestors to think this. I mean, faith formation is not hard to convince someone to be engaged in when they feel that kind of sense of vulnerability. So we are very porous and could be overtaken by these things. To give you an example that I learned from TV, but I don't know if there was a whole series about Victoria, at least in America, was shown on our public broadcasting show. But there was an episode in season 1 or 2 where she's pregnant. So this is the Victorian age. And she's pregnant, and she's told she cannot go to the zoo. Because if she goes to the zoo as a pregnant woman and sees an elephant, it's very possible that her baby will be born with big ears. Now that's a completely different conception of reality, that what a pregnant woman might see could get inside her to such an extent that it could affect the baby. And my colleague has done all sorts of research on mothering and has said there's all sorts of stories of women being frightened of seeing mice, because if they see a mouse, they could affect the baby. Or you shouldn't see anyone who's drunk on the street, or the baby might become susceptible to being a drunk. I mean, the sense of porousness that people felt, just it isn't there anymore. The closest we get to something like this comes from this is a very famous American commercial. I don't know if you guys had it, for Snickers. You know, Snickers bars. These were very famous commercials. All right, so you hear it. You're not you when you're hungry, and this is the way I parent. When my 14-year-old is acting like an absolute jerk, which is more often than not. We never think, the demons might be at him. We tend to think, didn't get enough sleep, is hungry. We even have a word for it, at least in America. We call it hangry, that you can be hangry. So what affects you may affect the constitution of your blood sugar and things like that, but it doesn't get into your own being. We think that there's a buffer that keeps from that. And that's a very different way of thinking about why the expressions of faith are important at the conditions, that people tended to feel quite vulnerable, and what you did every day would protect you from these realities. Now, if you were going to add an adjective in front of faith during this time, The adjective you add would not be like those religious professionals I talked to, vibrant, consequential, meaningful. There would probably only be 2 adjectives you could add in front of faith if you'd ever even think to add an adjective, and it would be holy or demonic. Those were really the only options of what you could add here. But this all starts to change, and change quite rapidly, as Charles Taylor tells us, when we move to the second of these ages. And this is what he calls the age of mobilization. Now, what happens here is essentially a great revolution, and it really does have its impetus in both the American and the French revolutions. And it's basically this idea that we, the people, get to decide how to organize our own lives. Where in the ancient regime, just as the king or the queen rules the domain, so God rules the heavens. Or the king or queen are supposed to rule their domain just as God rules the heavens, and they are God's appointed. There's this huge revolution now where we, the people, get to decide how we'll organize our own lives. Of course, it should reflect God's larger laws, but we, the people, get to decide how to do this. Now you start to see identity starts to change now. Identity starts to shift a little bit where the expressions and conditions are not completely fused, that they start to separate a little bit. But still that identity would be deeply a collective identity. It would be deeply embedded in a people who decide to do this. So there are a number of things that supported and upheld this. One was there a new move towards inwardness. That inwardness became really quite significant. And of course, the Protestant Reformation in many ways pushes us deeper towards this kind of inward sensibility. That inwardness becomes quite significant. To go back to Augustine, really the Protestant Reformation was a doubling down in many ways on Augustine's theological perspective. And one of the things that's fascinating about Augustine is it's all these deep inward experiences that he thinks is significant. The inward experience of realizing that he's taken that fruit as a young child and that he's broken God's larger law just out of the depravity of wanting to do it. Or he has the experience when he has this conversion of hearing a child singing, this inward experience of hearing a child sing that changes him. Or one of the most profound ones that I find really fascinating in the Confessions is where Augustine goes and he meets Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, and the whole thing that he thinks so much of Ambrose, but one of the things that just is shocking to him is that when Ambrose reads, he doesn't use his mouth, that he reads inside of his head. So Ambrose is like the first guy that creates silent reading, and reading for the sake of the internal constitution of your own mind, of your own inner life. Where Augustine was he was a rhetoric professor. The words are for speaking them, and even written words are to speak out to a group of people, but here's Ambrose reading internally. So there's something about the internal reality, and Protestantism kind of doubles down on this, that the internal really matters, that the internal is very significant. The second thing that happens, of course, and this is again because of the Protestant Reformation, is that speeds are over, the hierarchy of kind of speeds. Some live to pray, some live to work. There's a class of people who live to protect or to kill. And now there's this affirmation of ordinary life. And Luther, of course, is the great revolutionary on this, where Luther basically says that your home becomes a cathedral. And you, if you change diapers or you are a cleric, both you do before God, that this is a holy vocation too. To milk a cow or to change a baby's diapers is also a holy thing. So this move towards the affirmation of ordinary life becomes a very significant thing. Then what we have this big move, and this is particularly affected by science in some ways, but we move from this transition of being in a cosmos where God is deeply involved in this cosmos into a self-enclosed universe with laws and things like that. Now, we could talk about this all day, but an interesting example of this, I think, comes from what just happened a few months ago. Do you remember, I don't know if did you have this phenomenon in Scotland as we did in North America? So July 31st, 2018, we had the super red moon, this lunar moment. No pastor I've talked to since this has happened said, oh gosh, right after this, right before this, my schedule was booked. Because I kept having people knock on my door and saying, Pastor, did you see the moon? What is God trying to tell us? What does this mean for my life? Should I be afraid of this? Is this good news? It says, no pastor I know had anyone come up to them and say, I have to talk to you about what this actually means. And the point is in a cosmos, you expect even natural phenomenon to speak to you, to have something to say. But now we live in a universe, we know exactly what this is. This is just, we know the laws of what brings this about. Let me show you another Jimmy Kimmel clip that I find humorous that touches on this. So, two important points made in that comedy bit. One is how little that the lunar experience actually draws him out. Like, hey, it'd be cool if I saw that. But he can wake up, he can go to the bathroom and forget about this. It doesn't really draw him out. There's no deep anxiety, there's no deep vulnerability. And then, of course, the good bit about what this used to mean, that this would speak to something, but it becomes fodder for joke now to assume that lunar eclipse means, of course, an evil ruler has risen up to torment his people. So you see the very difference between living in this, where even the natural phenomenon in many ways would push one towards faith, or some kind of form of faith, where now that becomes just we become completely disengaged from that. The other element that's really important then is that duty becomes significant. And duty not just for a certain class of people, but duty for everyone. You think of this as about mobilization, that we the people decide to do this. In particular, you think about kind of the American project and even the kind of French Revolution, though it's different, is that every citizen has to decide to reenact their life this way. That every citizen has to decide that this matters for them. They have to do their duty. And as we're going to see as we go to the next period, this has become very hard, at least for democracies like mine, because people don't know if they don't even care to vote anymore, really. But there was this sense that we all, because we the people, we have to do this. So you have to be committed, you have to engage, you have to do your duty in the midst of this. Now, if we were living in the age of mobilization, which in some ways still hangs on with us, and you were going to throw adjectives in front of faith, you would probably have to throw big collective adjectives in front of faith. So you might throw in front of faith something like biblical or democratic or fundamental or modern. I mean, those are the kind of big adjectives you would throw in front of this, which is very interesting that those religious denominational officials were not using big collective adjectives like that when they talked about faith. They were using something different, which pushes us into our own time, and I think this becomes quite relevant for us, is that Taylor says we have entered into what he calls the age of authenticity. The age of authenticity. Now, to go back to that Bonhoeffer quote I started with, where Bonhoeffer says, since the days of the youth movement, we could parallel that with most of us kind of in the Western world, that the age of authenticity, Taylor thinks, really is a post-60s phenomenon. That the age of authenticity dawns in a kind of post-1968 reality. That this is a world brought to us by a completely different cultural shift that happens in the late 60s. At least in America, we say this often, that pretty much every political election for the last 40 years has really been a referendum on 1968. And this last one was as well. Hillary Clinton was known for being a kind of countercultural kid that spoke against the establishment, and Trump used all the rhetoric of you can't trust that kind of countercultural kind of perspective, and it's always been a shift back and forth of a referendum on 1968. But Taylor's point is, what happens is really through the youth movement that happens in the late 1960s, is a whole new kind of conception arises that really changes all of us within the Western world. And it is a kind of bohemian romanticism comes to bear. It had been in kind of enclaves throughout all sorts of parts of Europe and even in America, but it really becomes writ large across the kind of cultural reality. But one of the things that Taylor wants to say is that this is not just kind of a superfluous consumerism, but it actually comes with there's a deep ethic connected to it. And that new ethic that becomes pretty significant for us is that, first of all, this kind of sense of duty and obligation is overcome. Now, it's a kind of superficial example, but I think it's significant in a certain sense, that if you look at, in America, if you look at young people's articulations and what they were saying before World War II and what they were saying before Vietnam, I mean, you have to think of the differences of the wars, but it is starkly different. Where we have all sorts of records of 17-year-olds and 16-year-olds lying about their age so that they could go enlist and go to the Pacific and to the European theater. Where you have all this documentation of a generation and a half later, these young people saying, if I don't want to fight, I shouldn't have to. And the rationale for not wanting to do that isn't even, well, it's an unjust war necessarily, but I have to decide what I want to do. And I'm responsible for my own life, and I have to take responsibility for that. I often think about this in even the context of youth ministries, that we still always talk about a generation gap, that there's this generation gap. Unfortunately, sometimes we've used that to justify why we need a paid youth worker, is because the rest of the people in the church have no idea how to talk to a 16-year-old, and they seem like weird aliens. So we've got to get a professional who's been trained to work with these strange people, even though these strange people are your own kids. And so we got to hire a specialist to do this, because, man, I don't even know how I would talk about them. But there's kind of a misnomer, because whether the kid is 12, 13, or 45, 55, we're all living in the age of authenticity. And the real generation gap that occurred really was around that kind of pre-1965 generation and their parents. That was the true generation gap, from the move from the age of mobilization to the age of authenticity, where parents really did think their kids were nuts. Because they had lived that the point of life was to do your duty. That you do your duty, you do what you're supposed to do. And their own children were saying, if I don't want to, I shouldn't have to. The I shouldn't have to if I don't want to. I hate to say this, but that's pretty much how I'm raising my own kid. I'm trying to raise him to find himself and be obedient to himself and find out what he's good at. We get in conflicts all the time over screen time, and I don't understand half the stuff he does with the computer, but that's really more kind of substantively around kind of cultural practice more than it is around a completely different imagination of what it means to live a human life. So this ethic, Taylor says, is really this ethic that says every human being should define for themselves what it means to be human. And really across the West, we've had, this is what Taylor calls the ethic of authenticity. That every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. And anyone who tells another human being what it means for them to be human is not just a jerk, but is violating a moral category, is doing something that's out of bounds. No one has a right to tell anyone else what it means to be human. And we can see that this ethic, even in the last 15, 20 years, has become a much stronger ethic. And I think churches, I mean, you guys can talk about this better than I can here for sure. But churches are struggling with what that means. How do you even make normative commitments about what it means to be a human being, of what God calls us into, without violating the ethic of authenticity? And for younger generations of people, particularly millennials and younger, they are completely on notice of who violates this ethic of authenticity. And you can't tell another person what it means to be human. The last kind of sociological research, or the most latest, I should say, sociological research in the United States, is showing that these younger folks who are just going to university now or even younger, in America will be the most secular generation ever. And by that they mean not even any connection to faith community, never have really gone to church. But when they talk about what it would mean to be a Christian or what religion is about, they're skeptical of religion because religion tries to tell people how to live their lives. And issues around sexuality, issues around identity, things like that lead them to be skeptical of any religious community. This becomes a pretty fundamental challenge of how we think about and how we work our way around this. So one of the elements of this means that you should only really follow what speaks to you. So authority is embedded in what helps you work this out. Now again, one of the things I love about Taylor is he's very ironic about this. He says, there are some real gains. There are some real advantages to living in a world where we do have an ethic of authenticity. There's also some losses that happen within that. And how to balance and figure that out becomes a real challenge for us. And faith formation becomes very different when you're dealing with the ethic of authenticity. And how you even form someone becomes a very different reality. So to give you kind of another example of this, there's a pretty famous American New Testament scholar who speaks to a lot of people and tells this story. He tells a story about being out and meeting a young man. This young man was probably in his mid-20s, and he was a weightlifter, and he was kind of ripped like a weightlifter. And this guy was on fire for Jesus. So he was talking to him. This guy said, I love Jesus. I'm just giving my life to Jesus. And so they had this nice conversation. And so in the midst of the conversation, the professor asks him, where do you go to church? You're on fire for Jesus. Where do you worship on Sunday? And the weightlifter kind of stepped back and goes, well, I don't go to church. I don't worship on Sunday. And he says, well, why not? He says, I don't know. I just find it boring. Just find it completely boring. The professor stopped and said, let me get this straight. So you love Jesus? Yeah, I love Jesus. Like, how much do you love Jesus? I mean, I love Jesus. So do you think you would die for Jesus? He's like, oh, yeah, I think I would die for Jesus. But let me get this straight. So you're willing to die for Jesus, but not be bored for Jesus? And that's kind of the punch of his point. And his point is we need to get back to kind of corporate worship, which I completely agree with him on that. But what he doesn't understand is how the age and the ethic of authenticity works. And actually to be bored is almost a moral violation, because the only thing you should give loyalty and commitment to is that which is meaningful to you and the meaning that you make. So if it's boring, it's bad. It's a very different conception. If we go back to the ancient regime, why does Luther oppose the Catholic Church and say, here I stand, I could do no other? Because the Pope is the Antichrist. The church isn't boring. The church is demonic. The church is disobedient. You talk to most young adults across the Western world why they don't go to church. It's not because the church is evil. Maybe if you kind of take layers out. The main critique is it's boring. It's just boring. And before we kind of slough that off as superficial kids, it does have a certain ethic that embeds in, which is it's my job to find my meaning in life. And if this isn't meaningful to me, it really is something that I should avoid. And it's embedded in the fact that this ethic is that I have to find my own way to live my human life. This becomes a big challenge for us. Let me show you another video clip as we move towards lunch. I hope this doesn't offend you. I find this really, really funny. It comes from the comedy show Saturday Night Live, and it's kind of a spoof commercial for jeans. But watch how both the ethic of authenticity plays here, and how in some ways they're making fun of some of the excesses of the age of authenticity plays out here as well. All right, so you can see the age of authenticity play out pretty clearly there. So if you're going to throw adjectives in front here, this is where we start to get all those expressive adjectives. And it's one of the reasons these religious professionals, the denominational professionals, start throwing these adjectives in front. We need a vibrant faith. We need a deeply expressive faith. It needs to be a personal faith. It needs to be a meaningful faith. It needs to be consequential. It's really kind of a response to this deep kind of sense of being in an age of authenticity, that those adjectives become pretty significant. It's just an odd thing that faith itself, the statement of faith, isn't enough. We have to throw adjectives in front because we need this sense of me constructing my own life, me following what speaks to me. It has to connect in that way. So this becomes a pretty big challenge, I think, for us. So those adjectives become deeply kind of expressive along the way. So as we break for lunch, you can see how youthfulness plays in within this. And we could talk, again, all day about this, but I think this is where the Bonhoeffer quote becomes really significant, because one of the temptations, I think, for the church, and even our temptation with our commitment to young people in youth ministry, is to start to see young people as potential labels that make our institutions seem vital. And that's one of the things I really worry about in America, is that we've had all this sense of we need to attract young people. Not because we care about the humanity of young people, engaging their stories, but one of the ways inside the age of authenticity to give kind of a sense that your institution has some vitality to it is to give it a kind of sense of youthfulness. And I think this has done, at least in my country, has done a lot of damage, where a lot of work, a lot of money has been spent on attracting young people, but the objective wasn't to do ministry with young people or invite young people into ministry or hearing their stories and wrestling with God around those. It's that if we have a youth group, if we have a young people coming, if we have young families coming, it means that our institution isn't as weak as we feel like it might be. So it can lead to a kind of glorification of youthfulness, which I think Bonhoeffer's quote is a powerful one, where he says the objective of the church is not to capture the youthful spirit, but to actually engage with real young people and seek for the work of Jesus Christ in their lives. But it's a huge temptation for us in the age of authenticity, and especially in a time where all of us across the church feel a sense of decline, where we can turn to young people and think we need young people in because then we feel like we're dying less slowly. as opposed to where is God actually calling us. That will always be to the concrete humanity of young people themselves. But this becomes a huge temptation in the age of authenticity, where youthfulness almost becomes idolatry in a certain sense. And we have to, I think, be really wary of that. And especially those of us like myself who really want to advocate for young people themselves, is to be aware that what we're asking for is to bring young people into communities where we actually embrace their humanity and not use them as a way to make our dying or at times feeling stagnant churches feel like they have life. So it's a huge conversation, because we do have a certain glorification in the West of the youthful as the kind of most normative desire to be. The youthful one is the one who's the most authentic. And I think we can affirm the humanity of young people, but should be wary of that. But this leads us, as we stop and go to lunch, into thinking about this next move, which I call the Durkheims, or Taylor uses the Durkheims. And if you know the name Emil Durkheim, is kind of known as one of the fathers of sociology. And one of the things to know about Durkheim, we're not going to go too much into this, other than to say what Durkheim was really interested in was not really any kind of sense of confessional faith, as much as how religion kind of galvanized a society. And so Taylor wants to use this and kind of flip it on its head and show us what this looks like and what this means for us. So what we're going to do is take our religious professionals and put them in the DeLorean this time. And if we leave off here with Elaine and Marissa in the age of authenticity, and Elaine saying, when Marissa said she was done with church, it was like a cork shot out of my body, and I realized that I was done too. That resting in the age of authenticity, they don't know why they need faith or what faith is. They're kind of, that's when they think of faith, they think, what do I need this for in this kind of context? And does it violate this ethic of authenticity? You can guess, my presumption is where these religious professionals are is at a very different place. And that when they think about what faith is very different. So we'll put them in the DeLorean and get the flex capacitor going and take them through these kind of Durkheim moves. So that's where we'll go from here.